Hi, so
Hi,
happy to be here.
Wendy. Yeah, so happy to have you here. And I can't wait to hear about controlling our voices. That's our theme today. Wendy Demolino is a senior executive with more than 30 years of information technology experience, working with customers, driving technology innovation. She's worked a long time as an executive at Oracle. She's worked as an executive at Microsoft. She's a tech woman with a lot of great ideas. So I'm really excited to have you here today, Wendy.
I'm excited to be here. I hope my experience can help everybody else.
I'm sure it can. 30 years as a woman in tech, you have a lot to say because back then, I'm sure it's very different than it is today.
Very different. I'm excited to talk about controlling your voice because I know a lot of the podcasts are about finding your voice or sharing your voice. And I'm an extrovert. I could talk to a rock. My husband says he married me because I was great at cocktail parties. The big thing for me in my career was learning what to say and when to say it. And I say it was an ongoing learning because as you move through your career, what and how you say something changes and evolves and carries more weight. And you have to learn how to use your voice the right way so that you are really helping to drive the business forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. The how we use our voice is so incredibly important in business. Given your career, you've had these 30 years, what was the hardest part of it for you?
So I've had parts of my career where the work was super hard, but I wouldn't describe that as the hardest part of my career because at that time I was working super hard. I was doing what I loved. I was with people who were super fun and all of that. My hardest was when I was on a team, when I had a lot of the knowledge and I had this super hard drive, but not the respect or the support of others. And it's that time of my career that my best friend and I called the dark period. That's a period where I never really lost my voice, but I have to say I didn't really use it well. And so that was the hardest part of my career because you want to have impact, you have important things to say, and it's like you're saying them in a chamber where nobody's listening.
So you said you felt like you didn't have respect from people.
I didn't. I think it was more the time and the place. I was a woman in business. I was the only woman leader on the team at the time. I was relatively young compared to the other people in leadership. And this was an area where I hadn't learned to take that deep breath. And unfortunately, my frustration, I wore it a little bit. And as you do that, you become less approachable. People don't want to come to you with questions, concerns, or brainstorming because they don't know what they're going to get from you. And so that's where I really learned that you have to learn to moderate your voice. You can't have tremendous excitement and highs and really bad lows. You have to really be able to self moderate your voice at that time.
Would you say that at that time in your career, you had imposter syndrome?
I did have imposter syndrome, but a little bit in that time period I did just because I had a little self doubt saying, I know what I'm doing. Why isn't anyone listening to me? And then I realized a lot of it had to do with how I was behaving. I wasn't approachable. Where I really had imposter syndrome is when I had surprisingly a lot of people's confidence, a lot of people saying, you can do it. And this overwhelming feeling like, are they seeing something I'm not seeing? At one point in my career at Oracle, I was responsible for all executive level escalations. And all I could do was think was, oh, this is such big responsibility. Why do they think I can do it? I'm not even sure I could do it. But then I did it. But at a certain point, you have to say, you know what? The worst you can do is make a mistake. Just as my best friend says, fake it till you make it. Like that's how I got through it. I went in and I took care of business and I got my own confidence. And all of a sudden I saw what everybody else was seeing in me.
So does that mean that you were really focused on just doing what you were there to do?
Yeah.
And that led you to not overly think about if you deserve to be there or not, and your competence and all that?
That's exactly right. I think you said it best. At that point, it doesn't matter what I think of whether or not I can do it. I have to do it. The company needed me to do it. The customers, more importantly, because I was handling customer escalations. I always joke failure is an option sometimes, but in this case, I wouldn't be just impacting myself. I would be impacting my company. I would be impacting the customers that entrusted me with fixing the problem. Yeah, just I had to power through it. And I did find that I didn't know if I'd be good at it or not. And that's what led to the imposter syndrome. And all it took was a couple little wins, not even big wins, just little wins. And I felt I could do this. And once I did that, I have to say I've never really struggled with imposter syndrome since, just because I figured I'll figure it out. And I think that's how you get through imposter syndrome, is just gaining that own trust that whatever happens, you'll figure it out, good or bad.
That's another way then to beat imposter syndrome, is to go through it. Having it is actually a good thing. When you're able to handle it, then you develop that level of confidence. Like you said, I can figure things out in the future. So even if you feel it again, that you're equipped to move beyond it.
Exactly. Just build that competency and confidence. And I didn't have the luxury of picking a small thing at that point in my career. It was as large as I was handled. But in a lot of ways, I almost wish I had imposter syndrome earlier in my career, because then I would have learned that confidence and competency sooner when the stakes weren't so high.
And was that specific position one that was handed to you? Was it a surprise that that it was given to you, that responsibility?
Yeah, when I took a position, I was a director and I was leading a SWAT team of engineers. I interviewed for the position. That was a position I knew I could do. It was a good fit for me. I was really passionate. And literally on the day that I started, my boss, who was a huge advocate for my having this position, said, "Oh, by the way, you're going to be taking over all the executive escalations." So I think a little of the imposter syndrome just came from the perspective I hadn't had time to prepare. That was part of my job role. It was more like, okay. And so in that time in my career, I'm putting up weekly updates that are going to the president of development at Oracle, that are going to the head of North America for Oracle. And that's where it all came from. I hadn't had time to prepare and almost get myself excited about the opportunity.
So how long did it take for you to get those first few little wins and be able to overcome that imposter syndrome?
It happened pretty quickly, actually. The good news is I had experience to build on. And so I was able to leverage that experience. And I very quickly realized this wasn't earth shattering. It wasn't anything new. It was everything I had been doing, just to a different audience. And the stakes were much bigger, but I had the competencies. I knew what I was doing. And that's why they had the trust in me before I did.
Interesting. There's a lot of tips there. Get a few wins, realize that you have competencies that maybe are not direct, but that can do the job, and focus on who you're impacting. In your case, the customers and the organization and your boss who was trusting you with that role.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And one of the things that a lot of women especially have to handle at some point is the whole emotional side. Sometimes I've had the situation where I ended up crying and went running to the bathroom. So did you ever get emotional, or did you ever cry at work? How did that go? How did you handle that?
So in the early parts of my career, I can give you a list of people I cried in front of it. It's pretty lengthy. And it was a really important part of my journey of learning to use and control my voice, because I wasn't crying when my feelings were hard. I was crying when I was really angry. I didn't have the words. And so I would get frustrated. And when I would get frustrated, then I would cry, and then I would get more frustrated. And of course, I was in an environment 30 years ago where crying was not okay. It was not okay. And I was told as much. I was told that my crying was hurting my brand at the company, that people saw me as a really good technologist, but they would be afraid of what I would do under pressure, that kind of thing. And I realized I had to figure out a way not to cry. Now, the thing about today is, I think there's enough leaders like myself who have grown up in the industry, have 30 years of experience, and understand and are more empathetic and understand that not everybody's going to be a stoical person, man or woman. Some people, that is an emotional release for them. But at the time, I knew it was important for me. I thought about why I was crying. I was in a calmer moment able to articulate to my boss why I was crying. Listen, the feedback isn't what's making me cry. It's not the stress. It really truly is frustration. And when I explained it to him, it really opened up our ability to communicate better. And he actually said to me, I'd rather you react. It's okay to be angry in the workplace. He said, now I would ask that you react angry and of course professionally, but it's okay to be angry. And I think that just stemmed from years of me being a people pleaser. I didn't want to make people angry. And when I finally learned it was okay to be angry, it was okay to voice that frustration. I stopped crying, but also he realized that my crying was not being me being some timid mouse. It really was important. But I really do hope that leaders like myself now lead with empathy. We understand it. I know as a leader today, I always say to people who've cried with me, and I said, hey, I see that you're upset. Can you express to me what's making you upset? Is it the feedback or prompting them to find the words? But first and foremost, I tell them it's okay now.
Yeah. And you'll tell them that it's okay, but a lot of leaders out there are still not going to be okay. But what I love about your story is the fact that it was anger, it was repressed anger.
Oh, yeah.
Because of those people-pleasing social norms that we grew up with. And sometimes we're so repressed that we don't even realize that we're angry, that what's causing us to cry is that we're repressing our frustration because of social expectations. And I actually happen to agree with your boss that it's so much better to display anger in the workplace professionally than to cry, because at least it's a sign of passion. Like you want things to work so badly and to move forward that you're frustrated with the pace in which things are moving. I think it does come across more positively.
It does. And it leads to the next funny story, which is, okay, so I learned that boss was my boss. I was very fortunate that I had the same boss for almost 2 decades when I was at Oracle. And as I mentioned, it was an important part of our relationship because we learned how to communicate better. Another couple of years later, I go into his office in a bit of a rant. I can only call it a rant. I was on a roll. I was explaining to him the challenges of the day, as I say. And at the very end of it, he pauses, and he always used to be very thoughtful. And I loved this about him. And he would take a pause and he said, so do you feel better, or do I need to take some sort of action here? And I absolutely loved his reaction. I stole that reaction when I became a manager, because sometimes just the act of putting a voice to what you're feeling, you inherently feel better, right? So instead of bottling up and crying, put a voice to those feelings. And then you can either say, no, I'm a grown up. I've got my big girl pants on. I'm okay. I just needed to release it. Or you can say, listen, this is something that we really need to work on. And yeah, I would really like your help.
Wow, that's a great phrase to share, to use with the team members, because sometimes we just don't know if people are just need to vent out their frustrations, or they want us to take some action. And people have a hard time because of that, those emotions. They have a hard time in expressing what they want from others. So that's a great way to educate others on, hey, like, what do you want me, how do you want me to help you here? But he did listen to you
Oh, that's the thing. And that's
calmly.
the beautiful part of it. And I think because he didn't jump into solving the problem, he could listen better. If you're listening, not to solve the problem, but to just listen, you can solve the problem better. We all know that instinctively.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful way of doing it as a leader. Now let's jump to something else, which a lot of people experience, which are labels. Has it happened to you? Have you ever been labeled something in the workplace?
Oh my gosh, I've had different labels, good labels, bad labels, all of the labels. And you have to be aware of the labels. And I always say to people, you're never as bad as what you've been labeled on a bad side, and you're never as good. Don't read your own press. You're never that great. But it's important to know those labels because those labels are people's perceptions of you. And that is their view of reality, whether or not you agree with it. And I had one label. It was a pretty strong label, and it was, I get stuff done. That's a label you absolutely would love to hear. You give it to Wendy, she gets stuff done. And I'd like to think that is how I operate. I will deal with emotion later, but we have to live in the moment, which is solving the business problem. And I grew into that. However, not all the labels were ever always so positive. One label at the later part of my career at Oracle, my boss came to me and he said, "Let's share a little feedback with you." I'm like, "Okay, shoot." And he goes, we did talent review. And one of the things that was shared with me is that you're a bit polarizing." And I go, "Okay." And he was expecting a reaction that this was a negative word. And he said, "How do you feel about that?" And I appreciated him asking. And I said, I get where polarizing would come to mind. I said, "I've been in this company for almost 3 decades. I've done a lot of different jobs. And during those times, sometimes people appreciate the way that you do things, and some people they don't. And so in my career, I have people who think I'm the best thing since sliced bread, and there are people who maybe don't. And I'm okay with that as long as they don't, it's not so polarizing as that they would not want to work with me in a negative way." And he said, "Oh, okay. Nobody doesn't want to work with you." He said, "I just thought you should be aware." And it is a side effect of one of the jobs I had was handling executive level escalations. And that's a time when you really can't get caught up in the emotion, good or bad. People are going to want to blame and run for cover. And I could not always be as sympathetic to people's personal feelings in the moment. And that is because I had to think about the customer, resolving the issue at hand, and protecting Oracle, right? Doesn't mean you're unprofessional. It doesn't mean that you're rude in any way, but I'm not going to ask your permission to do what needs to be done. And that might rub people the wrong way and lead to a description of polarizing. When you think of polarizing, people either love you or they hate you, right? That's kind of
Yes.
a simplified version of polarizing. I had to come in like a fixer, right? And when you come in to fix a problem, there are going to be the people who view you as the fireman and, "Oh, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you so much." And then there are people that are going to resent you. There are going to be people that think that you're overstepping and why are you even here? And there was one conversation where I had with one manager where we went through the big group call and he was very clearly unhappy with my presence. He was very clearly very defensive. I tried to bring everybody along in a positive way, but at the end of the call, he and I had a one-on-one call, and I asked him point blank, "I can feel that you're not happy. I can feel your frustration." And I heard him out. And then I actually had to say, "But you and I don't have a choice for me to be here, right? We've got to work together. If everybody thought this whole thing was being handled exceptionally well and it was on the right path, I would not have been asked to engage. So let's work together and focus on getting the problem solved." And that's the way you have to handle it. You're not going to make everyone happy. He would have been happier had I not been engaged.
I'd rather be polarizing than overly agreeable.
I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely agree with you. Once again, in my dark period, I wouldn't say that I was polarizing because I was doing the right thing, though. That's an example of learning to control your voice, tying it back. Back during the dark period, I hadn't learned to pull that person offline and say, I have your frustration, I can hear your frustrations, and let's talk about it. There's another example in my career during the dark period where one of my colleagues gave a something that was marked on every single page, Oracle Confidential, to a customer. And instead of being mature and maybe having a more level-headed conversation, I said to this gentleman, what part of Company Confidential on every single page led you to believe that was a good idea? As a mentor, as a leader, as a manager, if one of my people had said that to one of their peers, rightly, I would be like, there's probably a better way to handle it. And that's what I mean by learning to control your voice. That gentleman who didn't want me there, was I frustrated by his behavior? Of course I was. But I learned it was better to empathize more, to ask questions rather than question him. Those are better tools in communication.
Yeah, no, that's a great example of controlling our voice. Have you ever had to control your voice in a situation where you experience discrimination?
There's overt things, and then there are less overt things. And then there are things that are intentional and unintentional. In my 35 years in industry, there have been lots of times where I experienced discrimination. Some of it was as simple as I was young, I was single, and so people just thought I had all the free time in the world because I wasn't married with kids. But the one that really I think hit me the most is there was a time in which I worked with a lot of former military officers. And these were flag officers. And for those that don't know, a flag officer in the US military are generals and admirals. They're at the very top. And so these are retired generals and admirals. And I'm not even 30 and I'm a woman. And so I was called the kid. Now, you could take it as a compliment. I was bright, I was energetic, I was filled with passion. Maybe those are the good things with the kid. But also, it almost infantilizes me. And you can't see it on a podcast, but I'm 5'2" and 100 pounds. So already I'm small statured. And now you're pointing out that I'm younger. And it was difficult because it led to my being left out of important meetings because they didn't think I was senior enough. And yeah, I have experienced it. I knew it was not malicious. I didn't go to HR, although people actually were encouraging me to. Other older women on the team were like, if I were you, I would go to HR. And all I could think of is, I'm going to try to manage my way through this and try to earn their respect. I wasn't as successful as I wanted to be, but years later, I got an apology. And in a lot of ways, that means a lot more than an HR thing, right? But you're going to encounter those things, and you have to learn, once again, the perception. Okay, I started wearing high heels every day to meetings, so I'd be taller. There were a lot of things that I did to ensure that I portrayed myself older than I was, but you're going to hit those things, and you have to choose, are you going to tackle it head on, which I tried to do myself, or are you going to go ask for help with HR? Neither is right or wrong. And if you ever have a malicious situation, I think that's when you really have to have HR's assistance in navigating, for sure. These were just men who were not used to a situation like they were in private industry.
If you had gone to them and said, hey, I don't like this, or please don't call me kid, which is something that HR would have probably done for you if you had asked HR, it wouldn't change the fact that they saw you that way.
Exactly. And that was my thought process exactly, which is that, and I was called the rookie by one of the managers because I was the last one in. And in that case, with one of the managers calling me rookie, I actually said to him, I said, we've hired these 7 other people after me. When do I lose the rookie tag? And I have to tell you, once again, there was no malicious intent. He just always saw me as this passionate young person he had hired, right? He told me later it was a wake up moment that he had to really see that while he gave me all the credit in the world that I had evolved and he knew he didn't mean anything by it, it was impacting how other people saw me. And that's the one thing to keep in mind is at any time that you feel like something is impacting how other people see you, I think it's important to speak up to someone, whether it's your own manager, whether it is the person who may have all the good intents and doesn't realize that their little nickname for you has some repercussions, or whether it's really malicious and you have to go to HR.
Sometimes it's hard to know if it's malicious or not. I think most times it isn't. People are just unaware of what they're doing, how it's coming across, and the consequences.
I agree with you. And that's why I typically think that if you can go to that person and state your concerns, most people will want to do the right thing. Where HR really is important is when it is impacting your ability to do your job properly and you don't have anyone else there, whether it's your manager or someone to support some sort of change.
That's fair. You've tried, you haven't been able to resolve the issue. You talk to your manager or other people, still it's impacting you and your job and your performance. It's almost like a last resort of sorts.
It is. And in a lot of ways, I almost wish I had gone to HR because while I did not leave Oracle at that time, I did resign.
Mm.
And that's when it all came out. It all came out like, why are you leaving? And boy, I wish I would have said something sooner. It would have saved everybody the hassle, right? But went back to being a people pleaser. I would rather take, at the time, before I didn't know how to control my voice and be my own advocate, I felt I'm going to go someplace else. And it was only in my deciding to resign, I ultimately did stay, that I felt comfortable speaking my piece on the matter.
That frustration, unspoken frustration, kept growing. And eventually it led you to want to resign after being in this company for such a long time, because it was a point where on one end, you weren't sure how to speak up and advocate for yourself without causing negativity, causing issues, being seen as the angry woman. And on the other end, you're like, yeah, I'm not sure if I should even say anything at all. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough when you're in the moment.
It is. I, through that whole experience, did learn to speak up. I became, once again, that was that dark period where I felt like I wasn't being listened to and I was the kid and all of that. And so I took that experience and I will tell you, I learned to advocate for myself. I learned I learned very quickly that the right people, the right advocates want to know how you're feeling, whether it's your mentor who can help you put a voice to it, whether it's your advocate or sponsor who want to see you grow further in the organization. There's no downside to speaking up.
And finding the right people to support you in that process and controlling your voice. And you said that at the beginning that you like speaking. Were you always comfortable drawing attention to yourself and being that person who is, hey, hello, it's me. Hi, let's talk.
Yeah, I have been, and it served me well. And so what I mean by that is I am an outgoing person. I have always been like a bridge builder. I love helping other people make friends. Going back to like when I was a child, that was just who I was. And what it leads to is the fact that I'm really interested in other people. So when I'm talking to you, I want to learn about you. It's just, I'm curious about people. And what I learned is it can be a really good thing if done in a really genuine manner. And especially in a very large company, because honestly, you have to sometimes be invited to parties. You can't have impact unless you're invited to the party. And by going out of my way to get to know people and understand what they do and let them see a little piece of me and what I do, there were many times that I was given opportunities in my career just because I got invited to the party. Someone knew I existed. And the other thing is it brings you this opportunity to help others along, right? Because you can then invite them to the party. You know who would be good at this? Tom would be very good at this, right? And it helps you in a lot of ways. Now, there's a downside because sometimes you're comfortable speaking up and the spokesperson gets shot, right? Sometimes, and you are the messenger, and we all know what happens sometimes to the messenger. And so that's a little bit of the downside, but I would rather speak up and say something and even couch it in, I may not have the full picture here, than not say anything at all and have regrets later that I didn't speak up.
A lot of regrets happen when we don't speak up. Making that choice between should I speak up or not is part of controlling our voice as well.
Absolutely. And knowing the right time to. And the reason I say that is I have been on a team many times in my career. I was fortunate enough to be the most senior person on the team, right? And so I have an opinion. I'm the senior person on the team. I'm more than empowered to give my opinion, or I've become artificially the team spokesperson, right? Everyone else is assuming Wendy will tell them. Wendy will say this, or will Wendy. And it's interesting because I'm try to be very good at leaving the pauses for others, doing some of the things that I know so that I don't drown out other voices. You have to be aware of that if you're the life of the party, if you've always got something to say. But in this one particular instance, my manager came to me and he said, Wendy, I know that you have a perspective and a point of view on just about anything. You've been in the company. At that point, I'd been with the company, I don't know, 26, 27 years. The company, the products, the people, honestly, you're going to have a point of view. He said, but, and I said, I need to shut up. And he goes, I wasn't going to say it quite that way. He said, your peers are relying on you to be the messenger. And in doing so, they're doing a disservice to themselves. And he said, I hear you give them pause. I hear you allow for them to jump in, but they're not. So I need you to not jump in. I need you to either miss a meeting. And he encouraged me to actually miss a meeting. And in one particular instance, I was on the call and doing as I was instructed, which was not to say anything, to let others speak first or ask their questions first. And my Slack was blowing up because they're like, are you going to say anything? And I actually said, I'm so sorry, I'm dealing with a customer issue. I'm not even paying attention. And it forced others to start speaking. That's the one thing I will say is understand that it's not only about giving them the room to speak, but making sure that they do speak, right? Because from my boss's perspective, he didn't even know if they were capable at certain points because I was hiding their competency or incompetence. Now, they were all amazing. They were all very competent. They were all amazing people.
Like your boss said, they were very reliant on you in being that spokesperson. And you observe this a lot in those interviews, team group, team dynamics. You always have the same person who is the spokesperson for that group. It's not that the others don't have the capability, but they're less comfortable being the spokesperson. And so only that one person is visible at all times. But over time, it does cause the rest of the people to lose confidence in their own voice and in their own perspectives and opinions. That's very insightful. That's a very interesting way to get people to speak up,
Yeah.
to not show up. I love that.
Show up. And I know it sounds horrible, but it did force everybody else to participate a lot more. And one of my colleagues, really amazing, said, later on, we just assumed you would take care of it. And I was like, why do I have to always take care? It does force that. It does.
When people assume that someone else is going to take care of it, then they sit back and relax and don't think as much, even though they're perfectly capable of thinking and having their own perspective.
Exactly. They don't have to do the heavy lifting in the meeting. And I've listened to your podcasts, and a lot of it is people trying to find their voice. I would say to them in listening, having been on the other side, it is a relief when other people speak up.
Yes.
Use that pause. It is a relief because you're like, oh, thank goodness I can go get a cup of coffee here, or I can, you're not disconnected, but you don't feel like your brain has to be moving every single second of the call because other people are contributing and providing those fresh ideas. So that's my only advice to those that maybe speaking doesn't come as naturally. You're doing others a favor.
That's true. Because you already mentioned this boss was really calm and nice. Have you ever had a boss who was maybe a little bit different in personality, was a little bit more difficult for you to handle personally?
Yeah. And I wouldn't say I've been very blessed. I've never had the stereotypical horrible boss. I've never had the boss who's trying to undermine me. I've never had a boss. If they did, I have no idea that they were doing it. I was blissfully unaware off doing my own thing. But I did have one where I was new to a title. I had just gotten promoted. I had just taken over a team that I had found was maybe not in as great a shape as I thought it was. And I found my boss really wasn't as supportive at the time. And there was a lot going on. And so it was really hard for me because I think in a lot of ways he was trying to get me to stand on my own 2 feet, to establish my own presence. Like looking at it as an outsider, I think these were the reasons that he did it. But I was left largely to do a lot of things all by myself with no support from him. And at the end of it, truthfully speaking, I was probably a lot better off because I gained new skills and competencies. I found myself even more confident in my ability to do that job. But at the time, from a personal perspective, the work got done, but at the cost of my own personal health. And the fact that because I didn't have, or I didn't feel like I had his support, and I didn't have him as someone I could brainstorm with or go to with a problem or concern, I internalized a lot of that stress. And it was a time in which I lost a tremendous amount of weight that I shouldn't have. Not everybody welcomes weight loss. And so it was a really hard time for me. But as I said, I got through it. I gained lots of confidence in myself. I gained a lot of things through the experience. And truthfully speaking, he came to view me as more of, I would not say peer, but a trusted advisor. Almost, oh yeah, Wendy went off and did all these things, and now I had almost earned my chops is probably the best way to say it. So good things came out of it, but those 3 or 4 months were very hard on me personally.
Would you have done anything different?
I did try to tell him once it was not a great thing. I scheduled a meeting. I did all the right things. He blew off the meeting. I do think I should have done what I would have recommended to anyone else in that position, which is I did not force a regular checkpoint with him. I was very respectful of his time and the fact that if I had this much problem, he had this much problem, and I did know that. And I didn't have imposter syndrome. So I was like, I'll just figure it out. But what I should have done is given him a lot more better visibility into not the day-to-day minutia, but having an ongoing dialogue so that he could actually really understand how bad it was or how hard it was or its impact on me. And just recently, I was meeting with one of my proteges who ended up in the hospital because just a lot of work. And the first thing I did is I said, you need to get 30 minutes with your boss. And I helped her formulate her message, but I said, take it from my learning. Do not let this go too long. Speak up.
That could happen to a lot of people if not dealt with, because it's the stress, it's the work, it's the volume, it's just the overwhelm and the repressed frustration, like you had mentioned. Have you had any sponsors? You said you had a few sponsors. So how did that
I have
happen?
had the best of sponsors. I have had the best of sponsors in my career. And I think your listening audience understands there's a difference between a mentor and a sponsor. The sponsors are there looking for the opportunity and advocating for you when you aren't there, right? And there are two stories that I think are really relevant. And one is that very early in my career at Oracle, back to being outgoing and just I'll talk to a rock. He wasn't a rock. I was at a big corporate event and there was a guy standing by himself. And I was only with the company 9 months, so I didn't know anybody. So I just thought he was another new person. So I walk up to this guy and I'm like, you have a very cool fish tie. It was a very cool fish tie. And we're talking and we talked for half an hour. I missed the meeting session. It was one of those big sales kickoffs because I was just having this delightful conversation with this gentleman. And we're talking and he's asking me about my background and he loved the fact I was into databases and had worked on DB2 mainframe databases. He was so interested in me and I was talking to him. And after about a half an hour, I walked away and someone comes up to me and he goes, do you know who that was? And I look at the business card and I go, Ken Jacobs. And he goes, no, do you know who that is? And I said, Ken Jacobs. And for those who aren't familiar with Oracle databases and the history of it, Ken Jacobs is this world-renowned Oracle expert. He was called Dr. DBA. He, for many years at Oracle, decades, was the head of database product management, decided what it was in and out of the Oracle databases. Pretty important guy. Right? But here he was saying, when you're in San Francisco next, come to see me. I always went to see him. He was wonderful. He was a wonderful sponsor to me. He encouraged me, let me know about opportunities in the organization that I might not know about. He told me about industry. This is before the internet, industry things that I might want to be involved in. He was wonderful. And if I could say anything about finding your voice is don't be afraid of those important people. Now, I didn't know who he was, so I didn't know any better, but he didn't know I didn't know who he was, and he was delightful and gracious and helpful. That's one. And then the other is I was very fortunate that through my career, I had the opportunities to work with Thomas Kurian, and I always felt he knew what I could do and the value I brought to the table. And so I think that's another one is that I always felt like, and I did see in a few times where by proving your competency, by being involved in hard projects, it really gives you the opportunity to build a brand and get the attention of very important people who can sponsor you. And so there were a couple opportunities at Oracle that I had just because Thomas and some of his senior leadership saw what I was doing with customers and how I managed customers. And it did provide more opportunity to me. And I wasn't afraid of the opportunity. And that's the important part is there to take the phone call, reply to the email, answer the question. You only have a few of those opportunities, take them. Because if you can demonstrate your competency, if you can demonstrate that you have good ideas, they don't have to be perfect, but people like Ken Jacobs and people like Thomas Kurian and others in big companies and small companies are always looking for those new people to sponsor.
In those projects that you were involved, were you looking for ways to present or to somehow be more visible to these leaders and to show your work?
Some of it is organic. So in some of the situations, you have to keep them apprised of what's going on. So in certain projects, yes, you have the opportunity, learn the way that they communicate well, and offer. A lot of people are so afraid of making a mistake that they don't understand that perfection is not the goal here, right? just do it. And so when I would be on these big, large group projects, I would volunteer because oftentimes as technical, as I was less technical than some of the incredibly smart people I had the privilege of working for and working with. And so I'd be like, hey, I'll put together the notes and I'll send the update. What did I get to do? I got to be the face of the project. I got to demonstrate my knowledge and management of the project to others that may not have the day-to-day knowledge. And so may seem trivial, may even be, you're thinking, why do I have to do it? Because you're earning the trust of other people in doing so.
Interesting. So these are all different ways of using one's voice, controlling one's voice for sponsorship, be it to volunteer for something or show up to the company events, company parties, and talk to people. Talk about what you're doing like you did. You weren't just asking questions, you're actually sharing more about what you did and what you were passionate about. And then whenever he did invite you to come see him in San Francisco, you took the opportunity and you did.
And I did. And that's the big thing. And once again, I think you said it best, is those opportunities only present themselves so often. And whether it is speaking up at a training class and asking questions, or maybe providing a perspective that's not already there. And like I said, some of it's organic. On projects, someone's got to send the updates, someone's got to do that. But how often do people sit in a room and have the very smartest people or very important people right there in front of them and don't take that opportunity to share something of benefit? Now, I do coach people. It may not be the best opportunity to complain or to, bring some negativity, but it is a great opportunity to highlight or ask a question about their perspective. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Once again, one of my lessons in working with people is don't act like you're questioning people, ask questions, be curious. And so if you're curious and you desire to really understand those people's perspectives, no one gets tired of talking about themselves.
And nobody will shoot you down.
No one will. No one will.
Wendy, this has been fantastic. You shared a lot of tips around how to really control your voice. And even if you have imposter syndrome, or if you feel like crying, if you're looking to make an impact, you're trying to deal with someone who's being a little bit more difficult, all those situations, getting a sponsor. Are there any other last thoughts that you want to share with our great listeners today on how to control their voice?
I would say learning to create the equilibrium, whereas I had to learn not to say things or how to say things, others have to learn when and how to speak up. And so I think it's really important to go back in a really good way and talk to people that you've worked with and ask how you could have helped the business better. And when you keep everything in terms of the business, how do we improve moving it forward? Could I have done more? Could I have said more? What were you looking for me to do? And it'll learn over time how you learn to moderate yourself and control that voice. But the other thing is be yourself, be your authentic self, right? If you're an introvert, that is okay. But be an introvert with a point of view. Be an introvert who is curious and asks questions. Be an introvert who is passionate about what they do, because then you will inherently want to speak up. That's a big thing. And then if you're someone like myself who maybe has a tendency to speak up too much, think about how you can bring others' perspectives in. If you hear yourself talking too much, you probably are, right? Look for pauses, ask others questions, learn how and when to use your voice, but do it in a way that allows others to bring theirs in as well.
Or leave the room. Or don't show up to the meeting.
Or don't show up for the meeting. That's really whether controlling your voice is really about learning how and when to use it, right? How to push others forward, how to pull yourself back, how to find those opportunities so your sponsor can notice you. Maybe it's not a fish tie, it was 1990, right? Maybe it's a background in someone, Zoom set, but find those opportunities to stand out in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. And Wendy, I must say, I appreciate the fact that after every response that you gave, even though I'm interviewing you, after every response, you paused.
I
And
do.
not every guest pauses after they answer a question. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me. Having recently retired, helping others navigate their careers has become my passion project. And so anytime I can help others through finding their voice or finding a new opportunity, I love to do it.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed having your perspective because for listeners here, she's done this for decades. She's achieved a lot of success, and you had a lot of time to reflect on these things as well, on all that experience that you've accumulated. So this is really good insight. So thank you, Wendy.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.